Picture this: a peasant preacher stands before thousands of armed followers, declaring that corrupt priests have no right to administer sacraments. Nobles tremble as commoners demand equality before God. The Pope launches crusades, but instead of conquering the Holy Land, Christian armies march against fellow Christians. This isn't some distant medieval fantasy. This is the explosive reality of the Hussite movement, a religious revolution that shook Europe to its very foundations and changed the course of history forever. Most people have never heard of the Hussites, yet their story contains everything that makes history absolutely captivating. Religious warfare, political intrigue, military genius, and social upheaval all collide in a tale that spans decades of conflict. These weren't just theological debates happening in dusty university halls. This was a full-scale revolution that challenged the most powerful institution in medieval Europe and won. What makes the Hussite story even more remarkable is how a movement that began with one man's religious convictions transformed into a military powerhouse that defeated 5 separate crusades launched by the Holy Roman Empire. We're talking about farmers and craftsmen who developed revolutionary military tactics that would influence warfare for centuries. They created weapons of war that terrified the most experienced knights in Europe and established principles of religious freedom that wouldn't become mainstream for another 300 years. But here's what's truly mind-blowing about this story. The Hussites didn't just survive persecution, they thrived. They built a society based on radical religious and social principles that challenged everything medieval Europe believed about hierarchy, authority, and divine right. They created the first truly democratic religious movement in European history, and their ideas about individual conscience and religious freedom would eventually inspire the Protestant Reformation itself. By the end of this series, you'll understand how a religious movement born in the Kingdom of Bohemia managed to hold off the combined might of Catholic Europe for over 2 decades. You'll discover the brilliant military innovations that allowed peasant armies to defeat heavily armored knights. You'll learn about the theological arguments that split Christianity before Luther was even born. And you'll see how the Hussite legacy shaped everything from religious freedom to democratic governance. The roots of this extraordinary movement stretch back to the late 14th century, when the Catholic Church was experiencing its most severe crisis in over 1,000 years. This wasn't just about theological disputes or minor corruption scandals. The entire structure of Western Christianity was fracturing under the weight of competing papal claims, widespread clerical corruption, and growing demands for reform from ordinary believers. To understand why the Hussite movement exploded with such force, you need to grasp the religious and political powder keg that was late medieval Europe. The Great Western Schism had torn the Catholic Church apart, with rival popes in Rome and Avignon each claiming supreme authority over all Christians. Imagine the confusion and anger of ordinary believers who suddenly found themselves unsure which pope was legitimate, which priests had valid authority, and which sacraments were actually effective for salvation. This crisis of authority created an opening for radical new ideas about religious truth and ecclesiastical power. Into this chaotic environment stepped a brilliant theologian and passionate preacher whose ideas would ignite a revolution that lasted for decades. Jan Hus, a Czech priest and university professor, began articulating arguments that struck at the very heart of medieval religious authority. Born around 1372 in the small Bohemian village of Husinek, Jan Hus came from humble peasant origins. His early life was marked by poverty and struggle, experiences that would later shape his deep sympathy for common people and his fierce opposition to clerical wealth and privilege. Despite these challenging beginnings, Hus demonstrated exceptional intellectual ability that earned him opportunities for education and advancement within the church hierarchy. Hus received his education at Charles University in Prague, one of the most prestigious centers of learning in Central Europe. Founded in 1348 by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, this university had become a hotbed of intellectual ferment and religious questioning. Here, Hus encountered the revolutionary ideas of English theologian John Wycliffe, whose writings challenged fundamental assumptions about church authority, papal supremacy, and the nature of religious truth itself. Wycliffe's influence on Hus cannot be overstated. The English reformer had argued that the Bible, not the church hierarchy, was the ultimate source of religious authority. He questioned whether corrupt priests could validly perform sacraments and suggested that the Church's vast material wealth contradicted the poverty and humility that Christ had preached. These ideas resonated powerfully with Hus, who began incorporating them into his own theological framework while adding distinctly Czech perspectives and concerns. By 1402, Hus had been appointed preacher at Bethlehem Chapel in Prague, a position that gave him a powerful platform to spread his reformist ideas. The chapel itself was significant, as it had been founded specifically for preaching in the Czech language rather than Latin. This emphasis on vernacular preaching reflected growing nationalist sentiment among the Czech people, who increasingly resented German domination of their religious and political institutions. From the pulpit of Bethlehem Chapel, Hus began delivering sermons that combined theological sophistication with popular appeal. He preached in Czech, making his message accessible to ordinary people who had previously been excluded from theological discussions conducted in Latin. His sermons attacked clerical corruption with devastating effectiveness, describing priests who lived in luxury while their parishioners struggled in poverty. He condemned the sale of indulgences, the practice of simony, and the moral failures of the church hierarchy. But Hus went beyond simply criticizing corruption. He articulated a fundamentally different vision of what the church should be. Drawing on Wycliffe's concept of the invisible church, Hus argued that the true church consisted of all those predestined for salvation, not the institutional hierarchy headed by the Pope. This invisible church was led by Christ himself, not by any earthly authority. Such ideas struck at the very foundations of medieval Catholicism, which was built on the principle of papal supremacy and hierarchical authority. The political dimensions of Hus's message were equally revolutionary. Bohemia in the early 15th century was dominated by German nobles and clergy, while Czech speakers found themselves marginalized in their own land. When Hus preached about religious equality and the priesthood of all believers, his Czech audiences heard not just theological arguments, but calls for national and social liberation. His movement began attracting followers who saw religious reform as inseparable from political and cultural independence. The growing popularity of Hus's teachings alarmed both religious and secular authorities. The Archbishop of Prague, Zbigněk Zajíc, initially tolerated Hus's preaching but became increasingly concerned as the reformer's influence spread throughout Bohemian society. In 1403, the university officially condemned 45 articles drawn from Wycliffe's writings, but Hus continued to defend many of these ideas while carefully avoiding the most radical formulations. The situation escalated dramatically when Pope Gregory XII issued a bull in 1407 forbidding the teaching of Wycliffe's doctrines. Hus found himself caught between his theological convictions and his loyalty to church authority. He chose to continue preaching his reformist message while attempting to maintain that his teachings were consistent with Orthodox Christianity. This delicate balancing act became increasingly difficult as his opponents pressed for more definitive condemnations. The crisis reached a turning point in 1409 when the Council of Pisa attempted to resolve the Great Western Schism by electing a third pope. Rather than ending the crisis, this decision created an even more complex situation with three rival claimants to the papal throne. Hus seized upon this confusion to argue that papal authority itself was questionable, since no one could determine which pope was legitimate. If the Church's highest earthly authority was in doubt, how could ordinary Christians be certain about religious truth? This argument proved devastating to his opponents and electrifying to his supporters. Hus began teaching that Christians should look to Scripture and their own conscience, guided by the Holy Spirit, rather than relying solely on church authority. Such ideas would later become central to Protestant theology, but in the early 15th century, they represented a radical departure from accepted religious practice. As Hus's influence continued to grow, so did the opposition he faced. In 1410, Pope John XXIII, one of the three competing papal claimants, issued a formal condemnation of Hus's teachings and ordered him to appear in Rome to answer charges of heresy. Hus refused to comply, arguing that his teachings were faithful to Scripture and early church tradition. His defiance marked a point of no return in his conflict with ecclesiastical authority. The stakes of this confrontation extended far beyond one man's theological opinions. Hus had become the focal point for a broader movement of religious and social reform that was spreading throughout Bohemian society. Noble supporters provided protection and financial backing, while common people attended his sermons in ever-increasing numbers. The movement was developing its own institutional structures and beginning to challenge not just religious authority, but the entire social order of medieval Europe. What made the Hussite movement particularly dangerous to established powers was its combination of sophisticated theological arguments with popular appeal. Unlike purely academic reform movements that remained confined to university circles, Hus's preaching created a mass following that crossed social boundaries. Nobles and peasants, urban craftsmen and rural farmers all found reasons to support his call for religious and social transformation. The movement's growing strength became evident in 1412 when Pope John XXIII proclaimed a crusade against the King of Naples and began selling indulgences to fund the military campaign. Hus denounced this practice from the pulpit of Bethlehem Chapel, arguing that the Pope had no authority to grant salvation in exchange for money, and that Christians should not support wars fought for political rather than religious purposes. His opposition to the indulgence sale sparked public demonstrations in Prague, with his supporters burning papal bulls and disrupting the activities of indulgence sellers. These dramatic confrontations marked the transformation of Hus's reform movement into something approaching a popular revolution. The religious questions he had raised were becoming inseparable from broader issues of political authority, social justice, and national identity. The stage was set for a conflict that would reshape not just Bohemian society, but the entire religious landscape of Europe. The momentum building behind the Hussite cause would soon face its greatest test, as powerful enemies mobilized to crush a movement they saw as threatening the very foundations of Christian civilization. What happened next would determine whether this religious revolution could survive the combined opposition of emperor and pope, or whether it would join the long list of failed reform movements that had been crushed by ecclesiastical and secular authorities working in alliance. The year 1414 would prove to be the pivotal moment that transformed a religious reform movement into an unstoppable revolutionary force. As tensions escalated between Hus and his opponents, a seemingly perfect solution emerged from an unexpected source. The Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, desperate to resolve the ongoing papal schism and restore unity to Christianity, announced plans for a great church council to be held in the German city of Constance. This council represented the most ambitious attempt in centuries to reform the Catholic Church from within. Representatives from across Europe would gather to address the scandals, corruption, and theological disputes that had plagued Christianity for decades. For Emperor Sigismund, the council offered a chance to assert imperial authority over religious affairs and position himself as the champion of church reform. For church leaders, it promised an opportunity to restore credibility and end the embarrassing spectacle of competing papal claims. When Sigismund extended a personal invitation to Jan Hus to attend the council and present his case, it seemed like a remarkable opportunity for peaceful resolution. The emperor guaranteed Hus safe passage through a formal letter of safe conduct, promising that the reformer could travel to Constance, defend his teachings, and return home safely regardless of the council's decisions. This imperial protection carried enormous weight in medieval society, as breaking such a pledge would be considered a grave violation of honor and political stability. The invitation placed Hus in an extraordinarily difficult position. His supporters in Bohemia urged caution, warning that traveling to Constance would be walking into a trap set by his enemies. They pointed out that previous reformers who had trusted in promises of protection had often found themselves betrayed and executed. The political climate surrounding the council was hardly favorable to radical reformers, and Hus's theological positions had already been condemned by powerful church authorities. Yet Hus also recognized the unprecedented opportunity that the invitation represented. Never before had a reformer of his background and controversial views been offered such a prominent platform to present his case before the highest authorities of church and state. If he could convince the assembled delegates that his teachings were faithful to scripture and early Christian tradition, he might achieve the kind of systematic reform that had eluded previous generations of reformers. The potential rewards seemed to justify the considerable risks involved. After months of deliberation and prayer, Hus made the fateful decision to accept Sigismund's invitation. In October 1414, he set out from Prague accompanied by a small group of supporters, carrying with him detailed written defenses of his theological positions and copies of his most important works. The journey to Constance took several weeks, during which Hus preached in various cities along the route, often drawing large crowds eager to hear the famous reformer speak. The reception Hus received during his journey revealed the extent to which his ideas had spread beyond Bohemian borders. In many German cities, local clergy and educated laypeople had been following his theological writings and were sympathetic to his calls for reform. This broader support network would prove crucial in the coming months, as news of developments at the council spread rapidly throughout Central Europe and influenced popular opinion about the proceedings. When Hus arrived in Constance in November 1414, the city was already bustling with delegates, observers, and hangers-on drawn by the historic nature of the gathering. The council represented the largest international assembly of the late medieval period, with cardinals, bishops, abbots, university theologians, and secular representatives from across Europe participating in the deliberations. The sheer scale of the event demonstrated the importance that contemporary leaders placed on resolving the Church's crisis. Initially, Hus was allowed to move freely throughout the city, preaching in private homes and engaging in theological discussions with interested parties. He used this period to build support for his positions and to clarify misconceptions about his teachings that had been spread by his opponents. These informal exchanges revealed that many council participants were more sympathetic to reform ideas than their public positions suggested, though few were willing to openly support such controversial positions. However, this period of relative freedom was short-lived. Within weeks of his arrival, Hus found himself under increasing pressure from conservative church authorities who viewed his presence at the council as a dangerous provocation. Cardinal Peter Daly and other prominent church leaders argued that allowing a condemned heretic to preach freely undermined the council's credibility and threatened to spread dangerous ideas among the assembled delegates. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Pope John XXIII, despite his precarious position as one of three competing papal claimants, insisted that Hus be arrested and held for trial. The Pope's supporters argued that the Emperor's safe conduct applied only to physical protection during travel, not to immunity from ecclesiastical prosecution for heresy. This interpretation represented a fundamental misunderstanding of medieval legal traditions, but it provided a convenient justification for those who wanted to silence Bohemian reformer. On November 28, 1414, Hus was arrested and imprisoned in a Dominican monastery, beginning a capt. The betrayivity that would last for months, all of Sigismund's safe conduct, sent shockwaves throughout Europe, particularly in Bohemia, where Hus's supporters viewed the arrest as confirmation of their worst fears about the council's true intentions. Mass protests erupted in Prague, with thousands of people demanding their leader's immediate release and threatening violent retaliation if he was harmed. The imprisonment of Hus created a diplomatic crisis that threatened to derail the entire council. Emperor Sigismund found himself in an impossible position, caught between his promise to protect Hus and the demands of church authorities who insisted that heresy charges took precedence over imperial guarantees. The emperor's credibility as a mediator and reformer hung in the balance, while the council's reputation for fairness and justice was severely damaged by the apparent betrayal of safe conduct. From his prison cell, Hus continued to write letters to his supporters in Bohemia, maintaining his theological positions while expressing growing pessimism about his chances for fair treatment. These letters, which were smuggled out of Constance and widely circulated throughout Central Europe, revealed a man of extraordinary courage and conviction who remained faithful to his principles despite facing almost certain death. His correspondence became a rallying cry for the growing movement back home, inspiring his followers to prepare for the possibility that their leader might become a martyr for the cause of reform. The trial proceedings that began in early 1415 quickly revealed the fundamental incompatibility between Hus's theological positions and the Church's determination to maintain traditional authority structures. Rather than engaging seriously with his scriptural arguments and theological reasoning, his prosecutors focused on extracting a complete recantation of his teachings. They demanded that he renounce not just specific controversial statements, but his entire approach to religious authority and church reform. This prosecutorial strategy reflected the deeper stakes involved in the Hus case. Church authorities understood that his ideas posed an existential threat to the entire medieval religious system. If Christians could appeal directly to Scripture and individual conscience against church authority, if corrupt priests lost their sacramental powers, if the papal hierarchy was merely human rather than divinely instituted, then the entire structure of medieval Catholicism would collapse. The trial was never really about specific theological points, but about the fundamental nature of religious authority itself. As the proceedings dragged on through the spring and early summer of 1415, it became increasingly clear that no compromise was possible. Hus refused to recant teachings that he believed were faithful to Scripture and essential for church reform. His prosecutors refused to accept anything less than complete submission to ecclesiastical authority. The tragic outcome seemed inevitable, yet the historical consequences of this confrontation would extend far beyond the fate of one reformer. The mounting tension surrounding the trial was creating unprecedented unity among Hus's supporters back in Bohemia. Noble families who had previously competed for political advantage were joining together in defense of their countrymen. Urban communities were organizing protests and petition campaigns demanding his release. Rural areas were seeing the emergence of popular preachers who continued spreading Hus's message despite official prohibitions. The movement was evolving from a reform campaign into something approaching a national resistance movement. The summer of 1415 brought sweltering heat to Constance, but the temperature inside the council chambers burned even hotter as the final phase of Jan Hus's trial commenced. What unfolded over those crucial weeks would ignite a firestorm that would consume Central Europe for the next 2 decades. The assembled delegates, representing the cream of European intellectual and religious leadership, were about to make a decision that would transform a theological dispute into a full-scale religious war. The proceedings had taken on an almost theatrical quality, with Hus appearing before packed galleries of bishops, cardinals, university masters, and secular observers. His physical appearance shocked many who had expected to see a broken man crushed by months of imprisonment. Instead, Hus stood erect and dignified, his voice clear and unwavering as he defended positions that he knew would likely cost him his life. Contemporary accounts describe him speaking with such eloquence and conviction that even his enemies were forced to acknowledge his intellectual prowess and moral courage. The theological exchanges during these final sessions revealed the vast chasm that had opened between traditional church authority and the emerging reform movement. When pressed to renounce his teachings about the invisible church and papal fallibility, Hus responded with detailed scriptural citations and references to early church fathers. He argued that his positions were not innovations but returns to authentic Christianity that had been corrupted by centuries of institutional development and political compromise. His prosecutors found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to argue that church tradition trumped scriptural authority, a position that exposed them to charges of placing human institutions above divine revelation. Cardinal Francesco Zabarella, one of the most respected legal minds of his generation, struggled to construct arguments that would satisfy both theological orthodoxy and intellectual rigor. The debates revealed that the Church's case against Hus was stronger on institutional grounds than on scriptural or theological ones. What made these exchanges particularly dramatic was Hus's refusal to engage in the kind of theological hair-splitting that might have provided face-saving compromises for both sides. When offered opportunities to qualify his statements or accept alternative formulations that might have satisfied his prosecutors while preserving his core message, he consistently chose clarity over diplomacy. His supporters would later see this uncompromising stance as evidence of his sanctity, while his opponents viewed it as dangerous fanaticism that left them no choice but to proceed penalty. The political with the ultimate dimensions of the trial became increasingly apparent as European we ruler side in on the proceedings. King Wenceslas of Bohemia, Hus's nominal sovereign, sent increasingly urgent messages demanding his subjects' release and threatening severe consequences if the reformer was harmed. Polish and Lithuanian representatives expressed sympathy for Hus's positions, reflecting growing Slavic solidarity against German ecclesiastical dominance. Even some French delegates, despite their government's general support for church authority, privately questioned the wisdom of proceeding with the execution that might create a martyr and inflame popular unrest. Emperor Sigismund found himself trapped in a web of conflicting obligations and calculations. His initial support for bringing Hus to trial had been motivated by a desire to demonstrate his commitment to church reform and his authority over religious matters. However, the proceedings had evolved in ways that threatened to undermine rather than strengthen his position. The violation of his safe conduct had damaged his reputation for honor and reliability, while the growing popular support for Hus in Central Europe threatened to create political instability that could weaken imperial authority throughout the region. Behind closed doors, desperate negotiations continued as various parties sought to find some middle ground that might avert the looming catastrophe. Moderate voices within the council proposed alternatives ranging from exile to house arrest, arguing that executing such a popular figure would create more problems than it solved. Some suggested allowing Hus to return to Bohemia under restrictions that would limit his ability to preach publicly while avoiding the creation of a martyr. These compromise efforts founded on the fundamental incompatibility of the positions involved. Church authorities, led by Cardinal Pierre Dailly and supported by Pope John XXIII, despite his own precarious situation, insisted that anything less than complete recantation would encourage other potential heretics and undermine the council's authority. They argued, with considerable justification, that allowing Hus to escape serious consequences would signal that the Church was too weak to enforce its own teachings and maintain doctrinal discipline. From his perspective, Hus viewed the proposed compromises as attempts to make him betray both his conscience and his followers. The letters he continued writing from prison revealed a man who had achieved a kind of spiritual peace through accepting the likelihood of martyrdom. He wrote to his supporters that he would rather die in truth than live in falsehood, and that his death might accomplish more for the cause of reform than his continued preaching ever could. The final sessions of the trial, held in early July 1415, took on the character of a religious passion play, with Hus cast in the role of the suffering prophet rejected by the religious establishment of his time. When given one last opportunity to recant, he delivered what witnesses described as one of the most moving speeches in the annals of religious controversy. He declared that he could not recant teachings that he believed to be true, that he committed his soul to God's mercy, and that he prayed his death would advance the cause of church reform rather than harm it. The formal condemnation that followed was delivered with all the ceremonial gravity that the medieval church could muster. Hus was declared a heretic, his writings were ordered burned, and he was handed over to secular authorities for execution. The sentence was read before a packed cathedral, with many observers later reporting that they witnessed something approaching a religious experience as Hus received his condemnation with apparent joy rather than despair. The execution took place on July 6, 1415, in a field outside Constance. Contemporary accounts describe Hus singing hymns as he was led to the stake, continuing his prayers even as the flames began to rise around him. His final words, according to witnesses, were a prophecy that within 100 years, God would raise up reformers who would succeed where he had failed. This prediction would prove remarkably prescient, as Martin Luther would post his famous theses almost exactly a century later. The immediate aftermath of Hus's execution revealed the explosive miscalculation that church authorities had made. Rather than ending the reform movement, the martyrdom of their leader transformed it into something far more dangerous and uncompromising. News of his death reached Bohemia within days, sparking immediate and widespread outrage that transcended social and political boundaries. The careful coalition building that Hus had undertaken during his years of preaching now bore fruit in ways that his enemies had never anticipated. Prague erupted in riots that lasted for weeks, with mobs attacking German merchants and clergy while demanding vengeance for their murdered leader. More ominously for the established order, the protests quickly spread beyond urban areas to rural districts where Hus's message of religious and social equality had taken deep root among the peasantry. What had begun as theological disagreements were rapidly evolving into something approaching a social revolution with religious overtones. The Bohemian nobility, many of whom had previously maintained cautious distance from Hus's more radical positions, now found themselves united in opposition to what they saw as foreign interference in their domestic affairs. A group of 452 nobles signed a formal protest letter condemning the execution and rejecting the authority of the Council of Constance to dictate religious practices within Bohemia. This document, known as the Protest of the Bohemian Nobles, marked the beginning of organized resistance that would soon evolve into military opposition. Even more significantly, the execution had created a powerful martyr whose memory would inspire resistance far beyond what his living presence had achieved. Hus had been a brilliant but ultimately academic theologian whose influence was limited by his scholarly background and institutional position within the church. His martyrdom, however, created a symbol of resistance that could appeal to anyone who felt oppressed by religious or secular authority, regardless of their level of theological sophistication. The transformation was already becoming apparent in the immediate aftermath of the execution, as popular preachers throughout Bohemia began incorporating Hus's martyrdom into their messages. They portrayed him as a Christ-like figure who had died for truth and justice, drawing explicit parallels between his persecution by corrupt church authorities and Jesus' crucifixion by the religious establishment of his time. These powerful religious images resonated deeply with ordinary people who had their own grievances against clerical wealth and privilege. Perhaps most importantly, the execution had eliminated the one figure who might have restrained the more radical elements within the reform movement. Hus had always been careful to maintain that his quarrel was with corruption and abuse rather than with legitimate authority properly exercised. His death removed this moderating influence and opened the door for more extreme voices who questioned not just ecclesiastical authority but the entire social and political order of medieval Europe. The stage was now set for the emergence of leaders who would make Hus seem moderate by comparison, figures who would combine his theological insights with military genius and revolutionary social vision. The religious reform movement was about to transform into something unprecedented in European history, a successful popular revolution that would challenge the combined might of emperor and pope while creating new forms of religious and political organization that pointed toward the modern world. The Council of Constance had succeeded in eliminating Jan Hus, but in doing so, it had created conditions for a conflict that would rage for decades and ultimately accomplish far more radical changes than the murdered reformer had ever envisioned. The Hussite revolution was about to begin in earnest, and its consequences would reshape not just Bohemia, but the entire religious and political landscape of Central Europe. The news of Hus's execution struck Bohemia like lightning, but the thunder that followed would shake all of Europe. Within hours of receiving word from Constance, Prague transformed from a bustling medieval city into a cauldron of revolutionary ferment. The carefully constructed social order that had maintained stability for generations began cracking under the pressure of popular outrage and religious enthusiasm. What happened next defied every expectation of how medieval society was supposed to function. Instead of the brief outburst of anger that authorities had anticipated, the Bohemian response grew more organized and more radical with each passing day. The execution had not crushed the reform movement, but had instead provided it with the most powerful weapon any revolutionary cause could possess, a martyr whose death validated every criticism that had been made against the established order. The initial riots in Prague quickly evolved into something far more sophisticated and dangerous. Popular preachers who had learned their craft under Hus's guidance began delivering sermons that went far beyond their master's teachings. They proclaimed that the Council of Constance had revealed the true face of the Catholic Church, showing it to be not the bride of Christ, but the whore of Babylon described in the Book of Revelation. These inflammatory messages found eager audiences among people who had already been questioning traditional authority and were now convinced that radical action was both justified and necessary. The theological implications of this shift were staggering. Hus had argued for reform within existing structures, maintaining that the church could be purified and restored to its original mission. His followers now began arguing that the institutional church was so corrupt that it needed to be completely replaced rather than reformed. This represented a leap into revolutionary territory that went far beyond anything medieval Europe had previously experienced. The social dimensions of this transformation proved even more explosive than the religious ones. Hus had preached about spiritual equality before God, but his followers began translating these ideas into demands for social and economic equality in earthly society. Peasants who had accepted their subordinate position as part of God's natural order suddenly found religious justification for challenging the entire feudal system that had oppressed them for centuries. The Bohemian nobility watched these developments with growing alarm, realizing that they had unleashed forces that threatened their own privileged position. Many had initially supported Hus as a way of asserting Czech independence against German domination, but they had never intended to create a movement that questioned the fundamental principles of aristocratic rule. The challenge they now faced was how to maintain control over a popular uprising that was rapidly moving beyond their ability to direct or contain. This tension between moderate and radical elements within the Hussite movement would define much of its subsequent history. The nobles wanted independence, but they also wanted to preserve religious reform and national their own and authority wealth. The common people, inspired by Hus's teachings about spiritual equality and energized by anger over his martyrdom, increasingly demanded changes that would fundamentally restructure Bohemian society. The first major test of this emerging revolutionary coalition came when church authorities attempted to restore normal religious services in Prague's churches. Crowds of Hus's supporters disrupted masses, shouting down priests they considered illegitimate and demanding that services be conducted according to reformed practices. These confrontations quickly escalated into violence, with several pro-Catholic clergy being attacked and driven from their positions. More significantly, the protesters began demanding that communion be administered to lay people in both kinds, both bread and wine, rather than just bread as had been the traditional practice. This seemingly minor liturgical issue actually represented a fundamental challenge to clerical authority, since the restriction of wine to priests had been one of the ways the Church maintained its special status. When ordinary believers received communion in both kinds, it symbolized their equal standing with the clergy in spiritual matters. The demand for communion in both kinds, known as utraquism from the Latin phrase sub utraque specie, became the rallying cry that united diverse elements within the Bohemian reform movement. Nobles could support it as an assertion of national independence from foreign religious control. Urban merchants and craftsmen saw it as recognition of their spiritual dignity. Peasants viewed it as a sign that God valued their souls as much as those of their social superiors. This symbolic unity around the communion cup provided the movement with a powerful visual identity that could be easily understood by people regardless of their level of education or theological sophistication. Hussite banners began displaying the chalice as their primary symbol, and the image appeared on everything from military standards to coins to architectural decorations. The cup became more than just a religious symbol, it represented the entire program of social and religious transformation that the movement embodied. The spread of utraquist practices throughout Bohemia created a parallel religious structure that competed directly with the official Catholic Church. Sympathetic priests began celebrating reformed liturgies in parish churches, while lay preachers established new congregations in areas where the regular clergy remained loyal to Rome. These alternative religious communities developed their own practices, their own leadership structures, and their own sources of financial support. The creation of this parallel church system had profound political implications. It meant that large portions of Bohemian society were no longer participating in the religious rituals that had traditionally bound medieval communities together. Instead, they were developing new forms of religious and social organization that operated outside the control of established authorities. This represented a degree of popular autonomy that was virtually unprecedented in medieval European history. King Wenceslas of Bohemia found himself in an impossible position as these developments unfolded. As a Catholic monarch, he was technically obligated to suppress heretical movements within his realm. As a Czech ruler, however, he was reluctant to take action against a movement that had strong popular support and was increasingly identified with national independence. His attempts to chart a middle course satisfied no one and contributed to the growing political instability that would eventually engulf the kingdom. The king's indecision created a power vacuum that more decisive figures began to fill. Among the Hussite leadership, new voices emerged who were willing to contemplate solutions that Hus himself had never advocated. These radical leaders began arguing that if established authorities would not accept peaceful reform, then violent resistance might be necessary to protect the faithful and advance God's kingdom on earth. The most influential of these new leaders was a minor nobleman named Jan Hus, whose military experience and religious conviction would soon make him one of the most formidable commanders in European history, unlike the university-educated theologians who had previously led the reform movement. Hus combined practical military skills with a deep understanding of popular religious sentiment. He began organizing Hussite communities for armed resistance while developing the tactical innovations that would soon terrorize the armies of Catholic Europe. Žižka's approach represented a fundamental shift in the character of the Hussite movement. Where Hus had relied on theological argument and moral persuasion, Žižka prepared for physical confrontation. Where earlier leaders had sought accommodation with existing authorities, he planned for total victory over the enemies of reform. This militarization of the movement reflected both the failure of peaceful methods and the growing confidence of ordinary Hussites that God was on their side in their struggle against oppression. The The transformation became evident in the summer of 1419, when tensions that had been building for 4 years finally exploded into open violence. The incident that triggered this explosion was relatively minor, a dispute over the release of Hussite prisoners, but it occurred in an atmosphere so charged with religious and political antagonism that even small provocations could have enormous consequences. On July 30th, 1419, a crowd of Hussite protesters marched to Prague's new town hall to demand the release of several of their supporters who had been arrested for disrupting Catholic services. When town councillors refused their demands and made disparaging remarks about their religious practices, the crowd's anger boiled over into violence. In what became known as the First Defenestration of Prague, several Catholic councillors were thrown from the town hall windows to their deaths in the street below. This dramatic act of violence marked the point of no return for the Hussite revolution. The throwing of officials from windows would become a recurring theme in Bohemian political culture, but this first defenestration had immediate and far-reaching consequences. It demonstrated that Hussite crowds were willing to use deadly force against their opponents, and it eliminated any possibility of peaceful resolution to the growing conflict. King Wenceslas, already weakened by years of political stress and personal excess, reportedly died of shock when he learned of the defenestration. His death created a succession crisis that would provide the Hussites with both opportunities and challenges. The designated heir was Wenceslas's brother Sigismund, the same Holy Roman Emperor who had betrayed his safe conduct to Jan Hus. The prospect of Sigismund's rule was unacceptable to most Hussites, who viewed him as this martyrdom. The ref architect of their leader-refusal to recognize Sigismund's authority meant that the Hussites were now in open rebellion against both church and state. They had moved beyond religious reform to political revolution, challenging the fundamental principles of medieval authority. What had begun as a theological dispute about church practices had evolved into a comprehensive rejection of the existing social and political order. This escalation came at a crucial moment in European history. The Council of Constance had successfully ended the Great Western Schism by deposing all rival papal claimants and electing Martin V as the sole legitimate pope. The newly unified church was eager to demonstrate its restored authority by crushing the Hussite heresy, while secular rulers saw the Bohemian Rebellion as a dangerous example that might inspire similar movements in their own territories. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test whether a popular religious movement could survive when faced with the combined opposition of the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe. The Hussites had already demonstrated their willingness to die for their beliefs, but now they would need to prove that they could fight effectively for them as well. The answer would come in the form of military innovations and tactical brilliance that would revolutionize European warfare and establish the Hussites as one of the most formidable fighting forces of their era. The religious revolution that had begun with Jan Hus's scholarly debates was about to become a military revolution that would change the nature of warfare itself. The peaceful theologian's followers were preparing to become some of history's most effective warriors, armed not just with weapons, but with the unshakable conviction that they were fighting God's own battles against the forces of corruption and oppression. The transformation of peaceful religious reformers into hardened warriors didn't happen overnight, but when it did occur, it fundamentally altered the military landscape of medieval Europe. The Hussite military revolution began with necessity and desperation, but it would evolve into a sophisticated system of warfare that rendered traditional knightly combat obsolete and introduced tactical innovations that wouldn't be seen again until the rise of gunpowder armies. At the heart of this military transformation stood Jan Hus, a figure whose combination of religious fervor and tactical genius would make him one of history's most successful military commanders. Born around 1360 into the minor nobility, Hus had spent his early career as a mercenary soldier, fighting in various conflicts across Central Europe. This experience had given him intimate knowledge of contemporary military practices and, more importantly, their weaknesses. What distinguished Hus from other military leaders of his time was his ability to see beyond the conventional wisdom that dominated medieval warfare. While most commanders relied on heavily armored knights supported by masses of poorly equipped infantry, Hus recognized that changing technology and social conditions had created opportunities for entirely new approaches to combat. His genius lay not just in understanding these possibilities, but in implementing them with unprecedented effectiveness. The foundation of Hus's military system was the war wagon, a fortified cart that could serve simultaneously as transportation, defensive position, and mobile artillery platform. These vehicles weren't entirely new to European warfare, but Žižka transformed them from auxiliary support equipment into the core component of an integrated tactical system that revolutionized how battles were fought. Each wagon was carefully designed for maximum military effectiveness. Heavy wooden construction provided protection against arrows and crossbow bolts, while strategic openings allowed defenders to fire out while remaining largely protected from return fire. Iron reinforcements strengthened critical areas, and the wheels were often fitted with spikes or blades that could inflict damage on approaching enemies. Most importantly, the wagons could be quickly chained together to form defensive barriers that were virtually impregnable to cavalry charges. The true innovation of Žižka's system lay not in the individual wagons, but in how they were employed tactically. Traditional medieval armies were essentially collections of individual warriors fighting according to established conventions of knightly combat. Žižka created something entirely different, a coordinated military machine in which every component was designed to support and reinforce the others. When threatened by enemy forces, Hussite armies would rapidly form their wagons into defensive circles called wagon forts or tabor. These formations provided protected firing positions for crossbowmen and early firearms, while creating obstacles that channeled attacking cavalry into predetermined killing zones. The psychological effect on traditional armies was devastating, as knights who had trained their entire lives for mounted combat found themselves facing defensive positions that their tactics simply couldn't overcome. But Žižka's tactical genius extended far beyond defensive warfare. He understood that static defense, no matter how effective, couldn't win wars or advance political objectives. His wagon forts were designed to be mobile, capable of rapid deployment and redeployment that allowed Hussite armies to choose when and where to fight while denying their enemies the same flexibility. The mobility of Hussite forces gave them enormous strategic advantages over more traditional armies. They could appear suddenly at unexpected locations, strike decisive blows against isolated enemy units, and disappear before reinforcements could arrive. This guerrilla-style warfare was perfectly suited to the political situation in Bohemia, where the Hussites needed to maintain popular support while avoiding decisive battles against superior numbers. The social composition of Žižka's armies reflected the revolutionary nature of the movement they served. Unlike traditional medieval forces that were built around aristocratic heavy cavalry, Hussite armies drew their strength from farmers, craftsmen, and townspeople who brought practical skills and religious motivation to their military service. These weren't professional soldiers fighting for pay or feudal obligation, but committed believers defending their faith, their families, and their vision of a just society. This popular character of Hussite armies created unique advantages that more conventional forces couldn't match. The soldiers understood the terrain intimately because they lived and worked on it. They had strong motivation to fight effectively because they were defending their own homes and communities. Most importantly, they shared a common religious and political vision that created unit cohesion far stronger than the bonds of professional military service. The religious dimension of Hussite warfare cannot be underestimated in explaining their remarkable military success. These weren't just armies fighting for political objectives, but congregations of believers engaged in what they understood to be holy war against the forces of corruption and oppression. Before every battle, Hussite troops would sing hymns, pray together, and remind each other that they were fighting God's battles against his enemies. This religious motivation created a level of discipline and sacrifice that amazed contemporary observers. Hussite soldiers were willing to accept casualties and hardships that would have broken less committed forces, not because they were indifferent to suffering, but because they believed their cause was worth any sacrifice. When facing seemingly hopeless odds, they drew strength from their conviction that God would protect the righteous and punish the wicked. The development of Hussite military effectiveness coincided with important technological changes that Žižka was among the first to fully exploit. Early firearms were becoming more common and reliable, though they were still relatively crude compared to later weapons. Žižka integrated these new technologies into his tactical system, using handgunners and small cannons to provide additional firepower from his wagon fortifications. More importantly, he understood how to combine different weapon systems for maximum effect. Crossbowmen provided accurate long-range fire, handguns delivered powerful close-range volleys, and traditional weapons like flails and polearms were used for hand-to-hand combat when enemies managed to reach the wagon lines. This combined arms approach was far more sophisticated than the single-weapon tactics that dominated most medieval armies. The training and organization of Hussite forces also reflected Žižka's innovative approach to military leadership. Rather than relying on individual prowess and personal honor that motivated knightly combat, he emphasized coordination, discipline, and mutual support. Soldiers were trained to fight as units rather than individuals, with each person understanding their role in larger tactical formations. This systematic approach to military training was revolutionary in a period when most armies consisted of warriors who had learned their skills through individual practice or apprenticeship. Žižka created standardized procedures for everything from wagon positioning to fire discipline, ensuring that his forces could execute complex maneuvers even under the stress of combat. The result was military effectiveness that far exceeded what the social origin soldiers would have suggested possible. The first major test of these innovative military systems came in 1420, when Pope Martin V proclaimed a crusade against the Bohemian heretics, and Emperor Sigismund began assembling a massive army to crush the Hussite rebellion once and for all. The forces arrayed against the Hussites represented some of the most experienced and well-equipped military units in Europe, drawn from across the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. Contemporary estimates suggest that Sigismund's crusading army numbered over 100,000 men, including thousands of heavily armored knights, professional infantry units, and siege equipment designed to reduce fortified positions. This was one of the largest military forces assembled in medieval Europe, reflecting the seriousness with which church and secular authorities viewed the Hussite threat. Against this overwhelming force, the Hussites could field perhaps 25,000 troops, most of them farmers and craftsmen with limited military experience. On paper, the outcome seemed predetermined, with the crusading army possessing every advantage in numbers, equipment, training, and financial resources. What the Crusaders didn't anticipate was that they were about to encounter a completely new form of warfare for which their traditional tactics and training had not prepared them. The campaign that followed would demonstrate the effectiveness of Žižka's innovations while revealing the limitations of conventional medieval military thinking. More importantly, it would establish the Hussites as a military force capable of defeating the combined armies of Catholic Europe, transforming a religious rebellion into a geopolitical crisis that would reshape the balance of power in Central Europe. The stage was set for confrontations that would test whether revolutionary military tactics could overcome traditional advantages in numbers and resources. The answer would come in a series of battles that would make Jan Žižka one of the most feared military commanders of his era, while proving that the age of knightly warfare was rapidly coming to an end. The collision between these two military philosophies produced one of the most lopsided campaigns in medieval military history. When Sigismund's massive crusading army finally crossed into Bohemia in the spring of 1420, the emperor was confident that sheer numbers and traditional military superiority would quickly crush what he viewed as a peasant uprising led by religious fanatics. His forces included the cream of European knighthood, battle-tested infantry from across the Holy Roman Empire, and siege engines capable of reducing the strongest fortifications. What Sigismund encountered instead was unlike anything European warfare had previously seen. The Hussite forces under Žižka's command refused to engage in the kind of pitched battles that would have favored the Crusaders' numerical superiority. Instead, they employed hit-and-run tactics that maximized their mobility advantages while minimizing their exposure to the enemy's strengths. Hussite wagon trains would appear suddenly at strategic locations, inflict devastating casualties on isolated Crusader units, and vanish before reinforcements could respond. The psychological impact on Sigismund's forces proved even more damaging than the physical casualties they sustained. Knights who had trained their entire lives for glorious mounted combat found themselves facing an enemy that refused to fight according to established conventions. The Hussites showed no respect for the elaborate rituals of medieval warfare, no concern for individual heroics or personal honor, and no willingness to engage in the kind of formal battles that had defined European military culture for centuries. The first major confrontation came at Sudomierz in March 1420, where a substantial force of crusaders encountered a Hussite wagon fort that seemed vulnerable to attack. The knights charged with their customary confidence, expecting to overwhelm what appeared to be a hastily constructed defensive position manned by common soldiers. Instead, they rode into a carefully prepared killing zone where crossbow bolts and early gunfire cut down horses and riders with methodical efficiency. The battle revealed the devastating effectiveness of Žižka's tactical innovations. The fort wagon absorbed the initial cavalry charge, channeling the attackers into narrow approaches where they could be targeted by concentrated fire from multiple directions. When the surviving knights attempted to withdraw and regroup, Hussite infantry emerged from concealed positions to attack their flanks and rear. The result was rout that left hundreds complete of crusaders dead, while the Hussites suffered minimal casualties. More importantly, news of the victory spread rapidly throughout Bohemia and beyond, demonstrating that the supposedly invincible armies of Catholic Europe could be defeated by determined defenders fighting for their religious convictions. The psychological impact on Hussite morale was enormous, while the effect on Crusader confidence proved equally significant in the opposite direction. The disaster at Sudomierz was followed by an even more humiliating defeat at Vítkov Hill in July 1420. This engagement showcased another dimension of Hussite military innovation: their ability to construct and defend fortified positions that rendered traditional siege warfare ineffective. The hill overlooked Prague and commanded crucial supply routes that Sigismund needed to control if he hoped to capture the Bohemian capital. Žižka recognized the strategic importance of the position and constructed a fortified camp that combined natural defensive advantages with innovative military engineering. Rather than building a traditional castle that could be besieged using established techniques, he created a complex of interconnected defensive positions that could support each other while providing multiple fallback positions if any single point was overrun. The Crusader assault on Vítkov Hill followed conventional siege warfare principles, with infantry attacks supported by artillery bombardment designed to breach the defensive walls. What the attackers encountered instead was a defensive system that had been specifically designed to counter traditional siege tactics. The Hussite positions absorbed artillery fire without significant damage, while providing protected firing positions that allowed defenders to inflict steady casualties on approaching enemies. The climax of the battle came when Žižka personally led a sortie that caught the Crusaders completely off guard. Rather than remaining passive behind their fortifications, the Hussites launched a coordinated counterattack that exploited weaknesses in the enemy's extended siege lines. The psychological impact of seeing their opponents take offensive action rather than simply enduring bombardment shattered whatever remained of Crusader morale. The victory at Vítkov Hill effectively ended Sigismund's first-adding campaign. His massive army, which had entered Bohemia with such confidence just months earlier, began disintegrating as units deserted or simply refused to continue fighting. The emperor found himself forced to withdraw from Prague without achieving any of his primary objectives, leaving the Hussites in control of most of Bohemia and in possession of enormous quantities of abandoned military equipment. These early victories established patterns that would characterize Hussite warfare throughout the revolutionary period. Their success depended not just on tactical innovations, but on the integration of military effectiveness with popular support and religious motivation. Žižka understood that his armies were fighting not just for battlefield victory, but for the survival of their entire way of life, and he structured his campaigns accordingly. The logistical advantages enjoyed by the Hussites proved almost as important as their tactical superiority. Because they were fighting on their home territory with the support of local populations, they could maintain their forces indefinitely while enemy armies struggled with extended supply lines and hostile civilian populations. Every village provided intelligence about enemy movements, every farm offered food and shelter, every craftsman contributed weapons and equipment to the war effort. This popular support network gave the Hussites strategic flexibility that their enemies could never match. They could disperse their forces when facing superior numbers, concentrating them rapidly when opportunities for attack presented themselves. They could retreat into friendly territory where pursuit became impossible, or advance into enemy regions knowing that their supply lines remained secure behind them. The religious dimension of this popular support cannot be separated from its military significance. The Hussite cause had become synonymous with resistance to foreign domination and corrupt authority, themes that resonated powerfully with people who had their own grievances against established powers. When Hussite armies moved through Bohemian territory, they weren't just military units, but manifestations of a popular movement that encompassed religious reform, social justice, and national independence. This integration of military and political objectives gave Hussite strategy a coherence that their enemies lacked. While crusading armies fought for relatively abstract goals like religious orthodoxy or imperial authority, Hussite forces were defending concrete interests that affected their daily lives. They were fighting for the right to worship according to their consciences, to be governed by leaders who shared their values, and to live in communities organized around principles of spiritual equality. The success of these early campaigns attracted attention and support from beyond Bohemia's borders. Throughout Central Europe, people who had been following news of the Hussite movement began to see it as a viable alternative to the existing religious and political order. Sympathizers sent financial contributions, volunteers arrived to join Hussite armies, and local movements began adopting similar tactics and objectives in their own regions. This international dimension of the Hussite revolution created new opportunities and challenges for the movement's leadership. The support they received from abroad provided valuable resources and demonstrated that their cause had broader appeal than their enemies had initially recognized. However, it also transformed what had begun as a local rebellion into an international crisis that threatened the stability of the entire European political system. Pope Martin V responded to these developments by proclaiming additional crusades and offering unprecedented spiritual rewards to anyone who fought against the Bohemian heretics. The papal propaganda machine portrayed the Hussite victories as temporary setbacks that would soon be reversed by the combined might of Catholic Europe. Church authorities organized preaching campaigns designed to mobilize popular support for new crusading expeditions, while pressuring secular rulers to contribute more substantial military forces. Emperor Sigismund, humiliated by his failures in Bohemia, began planning more systematic campaigns that would address the tactical problems his forces had encountered. He recruited military advisors who studied Hussite methods and developed countermeasures designed to neutralize their advantages. More importantly, he began assembling larger armies with better equipment and more extensive logistical support systems. These preparations for renewed conflict coincided with important developments within the Hussite movement itself. The military successes had created new political possibilities while also generating tensions between different factions within the revolutionary coalition. Moderate elements wanted to use their battlefield victories to negotiate favorable terms that would secure religious freedom and political autonomy within the existing European system. More radical voices argued that the movement's success proved God's blessing on their cause and justified pursuing even more ambitious objectives. They began talking about extending the revolution beyond Bohemia's borders, spreading Reformed Christianity throughout Central Europe, and creating new forms of religious and political organization that would replace rather than reform existing institutions. These internal debates would soon test whether the Hussite movement could maintain the unity and focus that had made their military victories possible. The challenges they faced were no longer just military, but political and theological, requiring different kinds of leadership and different approaches to problem solving. The stage was set for the next phase of the Hussite revolution, one that would see the movement reach the height of its power while also revealing the internal contradictions that would ultimately limit its long-term success. The military innovations that had shocked Europe were about to be tested not just against external enemies, but against the complex challenges of governing revolutionary society and maintaining unity among diverse groups with sometimes conflicting objectives. As the dust settled from these early military triumphs, the Hussite movement found itself facing challenges that no amount of tactical brilliance could solve through force of arms alone. Victory on the battlefield had created new realities that demanded political solutions, and the coalition that had united against foreign oppression began showing signs of the internal tensions that would define the next phase of their revolution. The success of Žižka's military innovations had attracted followers whose motivations extended far beyond the original religious reforms that had inspired Jan Hus. Peasants who had joined Hussite armies to defend their faith discovered that military service offered opportunities for social advancement that had been impossible under the old feudal system. Urban craftsmen found that the revolution had opened new markets and eliminated traditional guild restrictions that had limited their economic prospects. Even some nobles recognized that the changed circumstances might allow them to increase their power and influence at the expense of traditional rivals. This diversity of motivations created a movement that was simultaneously stronger and more fragile than its enemies understood. The Hussites possessed remarkable unity when facing external threats, but that unity masked fundamental disagreements about what they were ultimately fighting to achieve. These disagreements remained manageable as long as survival required everyone to focus on immediate military necessities, but success created space for competing visions of the future to emerge. The theological dimensions of these emerging divisions proved particularly complex. The original Hussite movement had been relatively unified around the Four Articles of Prague, demands that included communion in both kinds for all believers, free preaching of God's word, elimination of clerical property ownership, and punishment of mortal sins regardless of social status. These principles had provided clear objectives that could unite diverse groups around shared grievances against church corruption and foreign domination. However, military success and the practical experience of governing liberated territories raised new questions that the Four Articles hadn't anticipated. How should reformed religious communities organize themselves? What relationship should exist between religious and secular authority? How far should social equality spiritual matters? Different be extended beyond Hussite groups developed increasingly divergent answers to these fundamental questions. The most radical faction, known as the Taborites after their fortified city of Tabor, began articulating social and religious positions that went far beyond anything Jan Hus had envisioned. They proclaimed that the existing social order was fundamentally corrupt and needed to be completely replaced by communities organized around principles of Christian equality. They rejected the authority of secular rulers, eliminated private property in their territories, and established forms of democratic governance that challenged every assumption of medieval political theory. The Taborites drew their inspiration from apocalyptic passages in Scripture that predicted the imminent end of the existing world order and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. They believed that the Hussite military victories were signs that this prophetic transformation was already beginning, and that faithful Christians had an obligation to accelerate the process by destroying the institutions and practices that perpetuated social inequality and spiritual corruption. This radical interpretation of Christian theology created communities that functioned as experiments in religious socialism centuries before such concepts would emerge in their modern forms. Taborite settlements eliminated social hierarchies based on birth or wealth, required all members to contribute their labor to common projects, and made decisions through assemblies where every adult had an equal voice. These communities proved remarkably effective at mobilizing resources for military campaigns, while providing their members with living standards that often exceeded what they had experienced under traditional feudal arrangements. In contrast, the more moderate Hussite faction, known as the Utraquists or Calixtines, sought to preserve many existing social and political structures while reforming religious practices and eliminating the most obvious abuses of clerical authority. They were willing to work with sympathetic nobles, maintain traditional forms of property ownership, and seek accommodation with secular rulers who would guarantee their religious freedom. The Utraquist position appealed to urban merchants, skilled craftsmen, and moderate nobles who had supported the revolution primarily as a means of asserting Czech independence and reducing clerical interference in secular affairs. They valued the religious reforms that the movement had achieved, but were concerned that Taborite radicalism might provoke reactions that would destroy their gains and restore the old system with even greater oppression than before. These factional differences created ongoing tensions within Hussite armies and territories, but they also contributed to the movement's adaptability and resilience. The radical Taborites provided revolutionary energy and military effectiveness that could mobilize popular support and intimidate enemies. The moderate Utraquists offered political sophistication and international connections that could exploit diplomatic opportunities and maintain alliances with sympathetic foreign powers. Jan Hus's genius as a military leader extended to his ability to manage these internal tensions without allowing them to undermine Hussite military effectiveness. He understood that the movement's diversity was both a source of strength and a potential weakness, and he structured his campaigns to maximize cooperation while minimizing opportunities for factional conflict to interfere with military objectives. Hus's approach to coalition management reflected his broader understanding of revolutionary warfare. He recognized that successful rebellions required more than just military victories. They needed to create new forms of organization that could sustain popular support while adapting to changing circumstances. His military innovations were inseparable from social and political innovations that transformed how people related to authority, community, and each other. The organizational structures that emerged within Hussite armies became models for the revolutionary communities that developed in liberated territories. Military units were organized around principles of mutual support and collective decision-making that reflected the religious ideals of spiritual equality and shared responsibility. Officers were chosen based on demonstrated competence and popular approval rather than social status or political connections. This democratic approach to military organization proved remarkably effective at maintaining discipline and morale even under difficult circumstances. Soldiers who participated in choosing their leaders and planning their campaigns developed levels of commitment and initiative that amazed contemporary observers. They understood their role in larger strategic objectives and could adapt to changing situations without waiting for detailed orders from higher authorities. The success of these organizational innovations attracted attention from reformers and revolutionaries throughout Europe. Reports of Hussite military and social experiments circulated widely, inspiring similar movements in other regions while alarming established authorities who recognized the potential threat to their own power. The Bohemian Revolution was becoming a model for how oppressed populations might challenge existing systems of authority and create alternative forms of organization. This international dimension of the Hussite movement created new opportunities and challenges for its leadership. Support from sympathizers abroad provided valuable resources and diplomatic leverage, but it also made the movement a target for more systematic opposition from European powers, who recognized that allowing the revolution to succeed might encourage similar developments in their own territories. The Catholic Church responded to these developments with increasingly sophisticated countermeasures that went beyond simple military campaigns. Church authorities began developing new theological arguments designed to counter Hussite positions while organizing propaganda campaigns that portrayed the revolution as a threat to all legitimate authority. They offered significant concessions to moderate elements within the movement while intensifying pressure on radical factions that rejected any compromise with existing institutions and conquer tactics reflect. These divided growing understanding among the Hussites' enemies that military force alone couldn't crush a movement that enjoyed broad popular support and had developed effective organizational structures. The revolution had evolved beyond a simple rebellion to become an alternative system of religious and political organization that could survive and even thrive despite external pressure. The recognition that they were facing something unprecedented in European history led church and secular authorities to develop more comprehensive strategies for dealing with the Hussite threat. These strategies would combine military pressure with diplomatic initiatives, economic sanctions with propaganda campaigns, and direct confrontation with attempts to exploit internal divisions within the revolutionary movement. The stage was set for a prolonged struggle that would test whether revolutionary innovations in military tactics, social organization, and religious practice could create lasting change in the face of determined opposition from the most powerful institutions of medieval Europe. The Hussites had proven they could win battles and govern territories, but their ultimate success would depend on their ability to maintain unity and adapt to new challenges as their enemies developed more effective responses to their revolutionary example. The next phase of the Hussite Revolution would see the movement reach its greatest territorial extent and military effectiveness while also confronting internal contradictions that threatened to undermine everything they had achieved. The tensions between radical and moderate factions that had remained manageable during the early years of military struggle would intensify as success created new possibilities and new disagreements about how to use the power they had won. At the same time, their enemies were learning from their defeats and developing new approaches that would test Hussite resilience in ways that purely military campaigns had failed to achieve. The revolution was entering a more complex phase where diplomatic skill would prove as important as battlefield courage, and where internal unity would become as crucial as external victories. The story of how these challenges unfolded would determine whether the Hussite movement could transform temporary military success into lasting social and religious change, or whether the internal tensions and external pressures would ultimately overwhelm the revolutionary coalition and restore the old order they had fought so hard to replace. The death of Jan Hus in 1424 created a leadership vacuum that threatened to tear apart the very movement he had forged into such a formidable military machine. When news of the great commander's passing reached Hussite communities across Bohemia, the reaction was one of profound grief mixed with deep anxiety about the future. Žižka hadn't just been a military leader, he had been the unifying figure who held together the diverse and often contradictory revolutionary elements within the coalition. The circumstances of Žižka's death added to the psychological impact of his loss. He hadn't fallen gloriously in battle against the enemies of the faith, but had succumbed to plague during the siege of Přibyslav, a relatively minor military operation that seemed unworthy of such a legendary figure. The irony wasn't lost on his followers that a man who had survived countless battles and even the loss of his remaining eye in combat should die from disease in what should have been a routine campaign. Yet even in death, Žižka demonstrated the same strategic thinking that had made him such an effective commander. Before his final illness, he had taken steps to ensure continuity of leadership by establishing clear succession procedures and training subordinate commanders in his tactical methods. He understood that revolutionary movements were particularly vulnerable to decapitation strikes that eliminated key leaders, and he had worked to create institutional structures that could survive the loss of individual personalities. The most immediate challenge facing the Hussite movement after Žižka's death was maintaining the military effectiveness that had become their primary source of strength. The wagon-fort tactics and combined arms approaches that had revolutionized European warfare weren't secrets that died with their inventor, but implementing them effectively required experienced leadership and disciplined troops who understood their roles in complex tactical systems. Fortunately for the Hussites, Žižka had spent years training a generation of subordinate commanders who had absorbed his methods and could continue applying them even without his direct supervision. Figures like Prokop the Great and Jan Hus of Dubá had learned not just the technical aspects of Hussite military innovation, but also the leadership principles that made it possible to transform ordinary farmers and craftsmen into effective soldiers. Prokop the Great emerged as Žižka's most capable successor, combining military skill with the political sophistication needed to manage the increasingly complex challenges facing the movement. Unlike Žižka, who had been primarily focused on military objectives, Prokop understood that the revolution's long-term success would require diplomatic as well as battlefield victories. He began developing strategies that could exploit divisions among their enemies while maintaining unity within the Hussite coalition. The international situation facing the Hussites in the mid-1420s was becoming increasingly complex as European powers adapted to the reality that the Bohemian Revolution couldn't be crushed through simple military campaigns. The repeated failures of crusading armies had convinced many secular rulers that alternative approaches might be more effective, leading to a shift toward diplomatic initiatives combined with economic pressure and political isolation. Pope Martin V responded to these military setbacks by launching a more sophisticated campaign that combined religious propaganda with political maneuvering designed to exploit internal divisions within the Hussite movement. Rather than simply condemning all Hussites as heretics, church authorities began making distinctions between moderate elements who might be reconciled to Rome and radical factions that needed to be completely eliminated. This divide-and-conquer strategy proved more dangerous to Hussite unity than any military campaign had been. The papal offers of negotiation and compromise created genuine dilemmas for moderate Hussites who had achieved many of their original objectives and were concerned about the costs of continued conflict. They had won the right to practice their reformed religious ceremonies, had eliminated much of the clerical corruption they had originally opposed, and had established Czech independence from German ecclesiastical control. The Taborite faction viewed these diplomatic overtures with deep suspicion, arguing that any compromise with Rome would inevitably lead to the restoration of the old system of oppression and corruption. They pointed to the fate of Jan Hus as evidence that church authorities couldn't be trusted to honor their agreements, and they insisted that the revolution could only be secure if it completely eliminated the power structures that had made previous persecution possible. These factional tensions created ongoing challenges for Hussite military commanders who needed to maintain cooperation between groups with increasingly divergent political objectives. Taborite units remained committed to aggressive campaigns designed to spread the revolution beyond Bohemia's borders, while Utraquist forces were more interested in defending their gains and seeking diplomatic solutions that would secure international recognition of their autonomy. Prokop the Great navigated these divisions by developing military strategies that could satisfy both factions while maintaining the tactical advantages that had made Hussite armies so effective. He organized campaigns that combined defensive operations designed to protect Hussite territories with offensive strikes that kept enemy forces off balance and demonstrated continued revolutionary strength. The military campaigns of the late 1420s showcased the continued effectiveness of Hussite innovations, while also revealing the limitations that success had created. Hussite armies could still defeat any force that met them in conventional battle, but their enemies were increasingly avoiding direct confrontation in favor of strategies designed to exhaust Hussite resources and exploit their internal divisions. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1427, represented the most sophisticated attempt yet to counter Hussite military advantages. Rather than assembling a single massive army that could be defeated in one decisive battle, the crusading forces operated as multiple smaller armies that could coordinate their movements while avoiding the kind of concentrated engagements where Hussite tactical superiority was most decisive. This new approach forced the Hussites to disperse their forces across multiple fronts, reducing the concentration of force that had made their wagon-fort tactics so devastatingly effective. While they continued to win individual engagements, the cumulative effect of fighting multiple simultaneous campaigns began to strain their resources and test the limits of their popular support. The economic dimensions of prolonged warfare were creating particular challenges for the Hussite movement. While their control over Bohemian territory provided access to agricultural production and mineral resources, the constant military campaigns required enormous investments of manpower and materials that reduced the resources available for civilian economic activity. The social experiments that had flourished in Taborite communities during the early years of the revolution began showing signs of strain as military necessities took precedence over idealistic reforms. The egalitarian principles that had initially attracted followers were gradually being modified to accommodate the practical requirements of maintaining effective military forces and governing occupied territories. These practical compromises created disillusionment among some radical supporters who felt that the movement was betraying its original principles in favor of conventional political objectives. The revolutionary enthusiasm that had initially sustained Hussite communities through extreme hardships was being replaced by more pragmatic calculations about costs and benefits that made continued sacrifice harder to justify. At the same time, the success of Hussite military campaigns was creating new social dynamics within the movement that challenged its egalitarian ideals. Successful commanders and administrative officials were accumulating wealth and influence that set them apart from ordinary supporters, creating informal hierarchies that resembled the social stratification the revolution had originally opposed. The transformation of revolutionary leaders into a new governing elite was perhaps inevitable given the practical requirements of managing complex military and political operations, but it created tensions with the idealistic vision of Christian equality that had originally inspired the movement. These tensions would become increasingly difficult to manage as military success created opportunities for individual advancement that conflicted with collective revolutionary objectives. The international ramifications of continued Hussite success were also creating new challenges as European powers recognized that the Bohemian Revolution represented a fundamental threat to the existing political and religious order. The example of successful popular resistance to established authority was inspiring similar movements in other regions, creating the possibility that the revolutionary contagion might spread beyond Central Europe. Reports of Hussite military innovations and social experiments were circulating throughout Europe, providing models for other oppressed populations who were considering resistance to their own rulers. The techniques of wagon-fort warfare were being adapted by peasant communities in Germany, while the democratic governance structures developed in Taborite settlements were being studied by urban reformers in various countries. This international dimension of the Hussite revolution created both opportunities and vulnerabilities for the movement's leadership. Support from sympathizers abroad provided valuable resources and diplomatic leverage, but it also made Bohemia a target for more systematic intervention by European powers, who recognized that allowing the revolution to succeed might encourage similar developments throughout the continent. The Catholic Church responded to these developments by intensifying its propaganda campaign against Hussite ideas while organizing more effective military and diplomatic coalitions designed to isolate Bohemia from potential allies. Church authorities began portraying the conflict not just as a religious dispute, but as a fundamental challenge to all legitimate authority that threatened the stability of Christian civilization itself. This escalation of the ideological dimensions of the conflict made compromise increasingly difficult for both sides. The Hussites found themselves cast in the role of enemies of all established order, making it harder to find potential allies among European rulers who might have been sympathetic to more limited reforms. Their enemies, meanwhile, were committed to total victory that would eliminate the revolutionary example and restore traditional authority structures. The stage was set for a final phase of the conflict that would determine whether the Hussite revolution could achieve lasting success or would ultimately be overwhelmed by the combined opposition of European powers determined to prevent the spread of revolutionary ideas. The military innovations that had shocked Europe were about to face their ultimate test against enemies who had learned from previous defeats and were prepared to commit whatever resources were necessary to crush the Bohemian threat once and for all. The resolution of this struggle would have implications that extended far beyond the borders of Bohemia, shaping the future development of religious freedom, political authority, and social organization throughout Europe. The Hussite Revolution had already demonstrated that popular movements could successfully challenge the most powerful institutions of medieval society, but whether these victories could be transformed into lasting change remained to be determined by the conflicts that lay ahead. The pressure cooker of revolutionary Bohemia was about to reach its breaking point. By the early 1430s, the Hussite movement had achieved something unprecedented in medieval European history. They had successfully resisted the combined military might of the Catholic Church and Holy Roman Empire for over a decade. Yet this very success was creating internal contradictions that threatened to destroy everything they had fought to build. The paradox facing the Hussite leadership was both profound and dangerous. Their military victories had given them the strength to demand international recognition and negotiate from a position of power, but the price of maintaining that military strength was gradually undermining the revolutionary ideals that had originally justified their resistance. The movement that had begun as a protest against clerical corruption and social inequality was slowly developing its own forms of hierarchy and institutional power. This transformation became particularly evident in the evolution of Hussite governance structures. The democratic assemblies and collective decision-making processes that had characterized early Taborite communities were being replaced by more centralized command structures that could respond quickly to military emergencies and coordinate complex diplomatic initiatives. While these changes improved administrative efficiency, they also concentrated power in the hands of a relatively small group of leaders who increasingly resembled the traditional elites the revolution had originally opposed. The theological implications of these developments created intense debates within Hussite intellectual circles. Radical theologians argued that any compromise with existing power structures represented a betrayal of divine commands for social transformation and spiritual equality. They insisted that true Christians had an obligation to continue fighting until they had completely eliminated the corrupt institutions that oppressed the faithful and perverted God's message. Moderate voices countered that the movement had already achieved its essential objectives, and that continued warfare served no purpose beyond satisfying the bloodlust of extremists who had lost sight of the original reform agenda. They pointed to the practical benefits that ordinary people had gained from the revolution: religious freedom, reduced clerical exploitation, greater political participation, and improved economic opportunities. These competing interpretations of revolutionary success created a crisis of purpose that affected every aspect of Hussite society. Military commanders found themselves caught between orders to pursue aggressive campaigns that might provoke renewed crusading responses and pressure to adopt defensive strategies that would preserve their gains while seeking diplomatic solutions. Religious leaders struggled to maintain doctrinal unity while accommodating increasingly diverse interpretations of what their faith required in political and social matters. The international diplomatic landscape was also shifting in ways that created new opportunities and challenges for the Hussite cause. The Council of Basel, convened in 1431, represented a renewed attempt by church authorities to address the ongoing crisis through negotiation rather than military force. Unlike previous diplomatic initiatives that had demanded unconditional surrender, the Basel negotiations acknowledged Hussite strength and offered genuine concessions in exchange for reconciliation with Rome. The papal negotiating position reflected hard-learned lessons from decades of failed military campaigns. Church authorities had finally accepted that the Hussite movement possessed sufficient popular support and military capability to make crushing it through force prohibitively expensive and potentially counterproductive. Instead of continuing to treat all Hussites as heretics who needed to be eliminated, papal diplomats began distinguishing between moderate elements who might be reconciled and radical factions that remained irreconcilably opposed to church authority. The Hussite story reminds us that revolutionary change rarely follows the paths its founders envision. What began with Jan Hus's call for church reform transformed into Europe's first successful popular revolution, introducing military innovations that changed warfare forever and establishing principles of religious freedom that wouldn't become mainstream for centuries. Though internal divisions ultimately limited their long-term political success, the Hussites proved that determined communities could challenge the most powerful institutions of their time and win. Their legacy lives on in every struggle for religious liberty and democratic governance that followed.